We want to look at parables today. So you have here in front of you a picture of a pair of bowls. We're going to look at parables though today. The word parable means literally comparison. In Greek, the word is parabole, and in the Hebrew it's mashal. Both words mean essentially to compare. In the Old Testament, we have a whole series of different types of comparisons. Anything from a short saying or slogan called a maxim, we could also call it an aphorism, to something a little bit longer of a comparison like what we see in the Proverbs, or even parables like the parable that we have Nathan presenting before David when he sleeps with Bathsheba and kills Uriah. We also have riddles that appear, like in the stories of Samson when he talks about the lion and the honeycomb, or even allegories that occur in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have a broader understanding of parables that I think is a little bit more complete. It's an extended metaphor or comparison. Just like the Old Testament, we have maxims, proverbs, parables, riddles, and allegories, but it can be helpful for us to think about it not simply as comparing one thing to another, but it's an extended comparison or a metaphor. In the Gospel of Mark, we have 11 parables. In Matthew's Gospel, we have 29, in Luke 33, and John 2. So Luke has the most amount of parables, and some of our most beloved parables. You can think about the parable like the prodigal son that comes from the Gospel of Luke, and Mark has the fewest of the synoptics. The Gospel of John, of all four Gospels, has the least amount of parables, with having the story of the vine and the branches and the Good Shepherd being the two parables that come to mind from John's Gospel. We have another Gospel that is not part of the New Testament canon that's called the Gospel of Thomas. This is thought to be a Gnostic piece of literature, and there's actually 14 parables that come in the Gospel of Thomas, of which we have parallels with 11 in the New Testament, including probably the most famous parallel is the parable of the sower and seeds, found in the Synoptic Gospels, is also found in the Gospel of Thomas. However, Thomas tends to strip parables of their interpretation, of their meaning, because Thomas, as a Gnostic gospel, leans heavily on the idea of secret knowledge. And so for a person to hear these parables, it's proof of salvation if you're able to interpret them if you're not given the interpretation. The key to salvation for Thomas is not the death of Jesus, it's knowledge of Jesus, which is one reason that it's a heretical gospel, is that salvation is not dependent on what you know, it's dependent on who you know. Not what you know, but who you know. Thomas, in his various collections of sayings, includes some things that sound very Christian-like, and yet it ends up missing the point by focusing on the words of Jesus rather than on the person of Jesus. And that's a good reminder for us as a church to not miss the point, that there is a fine line between truth and heresy. That there's a fine line between a relationship with Jesus and just knowing of Jesus, isn't there? When we think about the types of comparisons that we see in the New Testament, there's a series of them. First, we have aphorisms, which are essentially timeless, wise sayings. It's almost like a fortune cookie. You can think about Mark 6:34. It says, "Don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring worries on its own." That timeless truth that we need to focus on today, that comparison that we see. It's unnecessary to worry about tomorrow because we have enough things to worry about today. We have short proverbs like in Luke 4:23, where Jesus says, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Physician, heal thyself.'" This is Jesus responding to his own hometown of Nazareth after he delivers a sermon saying that he's come to save not only Israel but also the Gentiles. Their response is, well, before you deal with problems of other people, maybe you need to deal with your own problems. This sort of proverb, of course, in the Old Testament, we have the entire book of Proverbs. We have riddles that are meant to help us to wrestle with the comparison. Jesus in Mark 3:23 speaks this riddle, this parable to them. He asks them the question, how can Satan cast out Satan? How can we plunder a strong man's house without first binding the strong man? Jesus gives this riddle, this question to his audience when they start to accuse him of casting out demons by the power of Satan. Jesus says that's ridiculous. How could I cast out demons if I haven't already first shown my strength, my power over Satan? Jesus just asks questions as comparisons. Luke 6:39 says this, can a blind person lead the blind? Won't both fall into a pit? Right? We still use that expression today, the blind leading the blind, whenever we see people doing things and instructing others when they clearly don't have the capability to lead and to follow through the things themselves. We have short sayings like in Mark 7:15. Jesus says there's nothing outside of a person that by going in can make them unclean, but it's the things inside are what defile us. Right? It's not what you eat that makes you, if you eat a turnip, you're not a giant turnip. If you eat a tomato, you're a giant tomato. It's what comes out of a person that matters, what's inside the heart. Now we get to things that are probably more properly called parables today. When people add up the parables in the New Testament, they tend to not think so much of these shorter sayings as much as longer narratives, like the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15, 8-10. Or we might think of things like allegories, like the parable of the sower and the seeds. The difference between a parable and an allegory is in a parable, a longer narrative, there's usually one main meaning. Or where, like the parable of the prodigal son, it's really the parable of the lost son. And it's about the father going out and finding this lost son. And it's a message of the grace of God. Henry Nouwen, of course, has a great book that deals with the parable of the prodigal son. And there's many reflections on longer parables like that. But then there's also allegories like the sower and the seeds, where every single element of the parable symbolizes something. The seed symbolizes one thing. The types of ground symbolize another. The sower represents something. Allegories like the sower and the seeds, or the parable of the vineyard at the end of Mark's gospel, where Jesus talks about this vineyard and the tenants of the religious leaders, and Jesus is the son. These allegories have depth and richness in them, where you mine them to find out what each aspect of the parable means. So there's longer narratives that have a bigger idea, and there's allegories where everything has a symbolic meaning. The key features to parables, if we're trying to interpret them, are these things. First of all, obviously, the purpose of a parable is to teach. That's the point. They're instruction. They're illustrations of the day. And it helps us to get at truth when we have relatable illustrations. One of the main things that the parables teach in the New Testament is that they're teachings about the kingdom of God. So the parable of the sower and the seeds is a parable about God investing the gospel in people's lives so that we can see the fruits of the kingdom. The other purpose is to teach us how to live, how to relate to God, and that's parables on discipleship. So how do we approach our relationship to God? You might think about the parable of the widow and the unjust judge, and how she is an example to us of constant prayer to God. You can think about the stories of the person who had to count the cost to build a tower in Luke, or the two sons in Matthew, how one person says, I'll go out and do this for you, Dad, and he doesn't. And then the other son doesn't want to do it, but at the end of the day does things. These sorts of parables are examples to us of how to be disciples. You can look at the parable of the rich fool who builds his barns as an example of the right and proper use of wealth. You can think about the friend at midnight who goes and asks his neighbor persistently for help as examples of persistent prayer to God. So parables tend to either be teaching us about the kingdom of God, about how God reigns or rules in this world, like the parable of the sower and the seeds, or they're parables about how to be members of this kingdom, like parables of discipleship. They tend to teach us one of two things. Parables consist of symbolic language. It's everyday language of those days. Nowadays, we aren't as connected to agricultural life, and so things that we see, like the sower and seeds, may feel a little distant from us. There's a real difference between going down to Home Depot and pulling up a batch of seeds and having to rely on the limited seed harvest of the year before. They are mirrors. They're meant to be mirrors to hold up, to be reflections on daily life so that people can gain insight from them. It's easier to talk about things indirectly. So I have a story of a friend. It makes it easier to talk about issues in life than directly confronting people. Parables have double meanings. So on the one surface there's a story, but then of course there's an alternate meaning to them as well. These things are keys to understanding the parables. With our distance of culture and time, the ability to see how things are everyday and ordinary usually requires picking up a good commentary or a good cultural book, or doing some reading or insight, or watching a video to help us to really get at the symbolic language. And then still using them today as mirrors, that they don't just reflect insight into ancient world people's lives, but also into our life today. I believe, though, that the thing that we've missed in many parables is this unexpected turn. The key to really understanding a parable is that there is meant to be something shocking to them, that we should be surprised by them. Probably the most famous parable that has an unexpected turn is the parable of the unjust steward, the dishonest steward, this steward who rips off his master, and because he's been a poor steward, his master fires him, and in the process the steward goes out and cuts people's debts down. And rather than chastising this man for further being bad at his job, the master praises him. You go, what's the deal? How could this be? How is this a model for discipleship? And that's the shock value, the twist. And Jesus' point is, look, if people in this world can use their worldly wealth for their own dishonest gain, how much more should people of the kingdom of God know how to use wealth to build the kingdom, something that's eternal, not advancing our own individual kingdoms. The parable of the unjust steward is a parable of comparison, a lesser to greater comparison. We are not to be like him. We are not to mimic and rip people off. Instead, we are called to be better than him. Shouldn't we do better? The parable of the sower and the seeds is another good example. We tend to say, well, focus on the graciousness of the person. People will sometimes bring interpretations in to explain why the seeds got cast in different paths. The reality is this person is a bad sower. You wouldn't hire this person to sow your seed because he's throwing things around here and there and everywhere, and that's just bad practice. And what's shocking is that Jesus compares himself to a bad sower and says the kingdom of God is about not caring where the seed lies, that's not what matters. There's a sense of abundanceness and generosity that comes. The shock that this person would waste this precious seed that took a year of harvest to get. You couldn't go down to Home Depot to get it. You had to grow it. And here, this man is willing to waste it rather than carefully investing where it goes in the field. It's so counterintuitive to good agricultural practice. And just like God's graciousness is so counterintuitive. We want to make things count, and this is a good lesson for us. For in our culture of efficiency and making things count, we think that it's a waste if we don't see the fruits of our labor. And Jesus' point in the parable of sower and seeds is we do see the fruits of our labor, that everyone deserves an opportunity, deserves a chance, no matter how controversial it may seem, no matter how wasteful it may seem. The grace of God is for everyone. It's up to people to decide whether they are going to choose it or not, the cultivation of the ground for the seed's receptivity. The way we interpret parables are several ways. Some people like to interpret parables allegorically, so everything in the parable means something. So this moves beyond the parable of the sower and the seed. So like the parable of the prodigal son, Augustine saw that parable as a parable of salvation. And so the robbers end up being people like Satan trying to pull away the grace of God from people's lives. Modern moves tend to see parables as having only one meaning and one meaning alone. We'll probably find ourselves torn between having a multiple valence of meanings through the allegorical interpretation on the one hand, or just having a singular meaning on the other. The way that we figure out whether a parable has multiple meanings, like the allegorical one, is through various textual clues. We can look at the internal features of the parable, or we can look at the context of the parable, or we can look at the context within the social world. So within the unjust steward, in the midst of this perplexing story of this dishonest servant who goes and rips his master off, the fact that Jesus says to us, the point of the parable, is that this man was unjust and used his worldly wealth for dishonest gain, is a challenge to the people of the kingdom of God to use wealth for godly gain. The internal features give us the clue to the meaning of the parable. The external context, if you look in Luke 15, there's a whole series of parables on lost things. There's a lost coin, there's a lost sheep, and then there's the lost son, or the prodigal son. The context of these three parables in Luke 15 help us to see the overall picture of God's graciousness of seeking out lost things and the cause for celebration when things are found. Finally, we have to look at the social context. With a story like the Good Samaritan, it's important to look at the social values. The thing that we often pick up on with the Good Samaritan is, he is not a Jewish person. And that the religious leaders, the priests and Levites, those were the people who worship God in the temple. They were supposed to be the best of the best. And it's the Samaritan who shames them. But if you look further at the social context, it's not only is the Samaritan not a Jew, but he's a heretic. A Samaritan worships God on Mount Gerizim at the wrong temple. They sacrifice, they're part of the golden calf tradition. They even have a different Bible, a different Pentateuch than the Bible. So this guy, he's a heretic. And what is shocking about the parable of the Good Samaritan is that it's the heretic who has so many things wrong with his theology that gets this one thing right, that when there's someone who's in need on the side of the road, he reaches out and he helps them. The parable of the Good Samaritan is a story to shame people who are followers of God. It's saying, look how the world acts. If the world can act in ways that are loving and graciousness and kind, and the church fails, what does that say about the church? We should be doing a better job at it. The priest, the Levite, the representatives of God in the temple should have done a better job, but they didn't. They missed it. They were so caught up with themselves, so caught up with their own self-righteousness, that they missed out on the opportunity of reaching out and bringing someone to the kingdom of God. So, textual concludes, internal features, external context, and social cultural context bring tremendous insight into the parables and help us to hold them up as mirrors to our own life and to help us to understand them further. The key to interpreting a parable, ultimately with all these things, is the unexpected turn. Not every parable has it, but most of them do. There should be something shocking. There should be something jarring that gets us to rethink our values, because the kingdom's values are penetrating into our life and transforming and upsetting everything and turning the world, instead of being upside down, back right side up.